So let me get this straight. This movie cost $300 million to make. It had all of these over-the-top special effects, and they couldn't afford any realistic-looking eggs? That's actually really sad. Batman v Superman, the second entry in the infamous DC universe and the most intense divide between audiences and critics since, well, the last time DC tried to make a consistently good movie. After its release, it's been met with a lot, and I mean a lot, of nasty feedback. Even fans of Man of Steel didn't like this one. I mean, they were making it seem like nobody liked this movie at all. But is it really as bad as people say it is? Oh yes, it is. It really is. It's practically in the top 10 worst movies that came out in 2016. But is it possible that maybe there was something in the movie that was worth appreciating? Kind of? Alright, let's just take a look. Following the events of Man of Steel, we see that the world is in a state of uncertainty in the presence of Superman. In the midst of this, a mysterious vigilante is making his name known in Gotham City as the Batman, who displays extreme methods of dealing with crime that don't fit well with Clark Kent. As tension rises between how the world views Superman and how Superman sees Batman, Lois is trying to uncover a ploy to frame Superman for several deaths with only a single bullet as a clue. Despite that, no one in their right mind would believe for a second that Superman would need a gun. And while that's going on, Lex Luthor is planning to make Superman look like a fraud as he also tries to construct a diabolical plan to weaponize kryptonite and kill Superman with it. Meanwhile, Superman is conflicting over his place in the world despite that he just finished doing that in the events of the previous film. And while that's going on, Wonder Woman is snooping around looking for information on the two as she's searching for data on metahumans. And while that's going on, Bruce is in conflict with Alfred over what it truly means to be the Batman. And while that's going on, Lex Luthor finds a way to weaponize the corpse of Zod by combining the corpse with his DNA and a Kryptonian supercomputer. And while that's going on, Lex has Lois and Miss Kent kidnapped as leverage to make Superman fight Batman. And while that's going on, Batman is having some kind of future-gazing dream of a threat that could endanger all known life in the galaxy. Okay, what is going on here? Okay, this is bullshit, alright? I can't follow what's going on anymore, and I'm assuming the rest of you can't either. This movie is beyond unfocused, beyond badly paced, beyond poorly constructed. There are far too many subplots going on, and the movie takes far too much pleasure in bouncing between each one. The transitions between scenes and subplots are so badly done that it feels like a bunch of different movies constantly interrupting each other. And because of how confusing it gets, you lose track of each plot thread and forget about what the hell is even going on. One of the main reasons why this movie is so painfully bad is because it's obsessed with throwing as much shit at the audience as possible. It thinks it makes the stakes higher and the story more dramatic, but it doesn't accomplish any remarkable feats with its runtime. And it weakens the overall core of the themes. There is far too much to keep track of, to the point that by the time you have a chance to piece something together, you'll have already stopped giving a shit. Oh, but you might say that's because they're all stuck together. What if they were looked at individually? Well, that doesn't work, because when you look at them on their own, they become even worse. There's the issue of Superman mostly going through the same motions from Man of Steel. They tried to hide the fact that they're recycling from the first movie with these cheap gimmicks that involve the other poorly done plot lines and with all this dumb controversy stuff with the media, and it doesn't work. It doesn't even make sense for Superman to go through this again because it was pretty much resolved in the last movie. It felt unique to the Man of Steel because we were seeing a side of Superman that we've never seen before. A level of uncertainty mixed into a coming-of-age story. A man who's constantly struggling to decide what his massive power should be used for while trying to find his place in a world that he barely knows. By going through all of this again, it's showing that he learned nothing from the events of the first movie. His stepfather's sacrifice, his biological father's guidance, his talks with Lois and Martha Kent, none of that has had an impact impact on him in the slightest. And Lois Lane is definitely not much better. As a matter of fact, she's possibly one of the worst things about the movie. I mean, she didn't really accomplish anything in Man of Steel, but in some way she felt important in the core of the narrative due to her relationship with Clark, and her efforts to understand him as a stranger to Earth. Here, there is little to no weight within anything that she gets into. And despite being completely pointless and useless, the film is constantly treating her like she's important. It's constantly trying to convince you that she matters in the grand scheme of things, but because of the horrible pacing and the constant shift between plot points, not to mention how little focus she gets, she ends up being completely insignificant. And aside from that, she's a complete idiot as well. I mean, confronting Lex Luthor on her own despite knowing how dangerous he is? The guy fucking blew up an embassy. You should at least make sure that Superman is there to back you up. She ends up even becoming somewhat of a plot device. She discards the Kryptonian spear just to immediately go back for it later, which creates a situation where she needs to get rescued by Superman, but that requires him to get close to the kryptonite spear, thus weakening him enough for Doomsday to fatally stab him. Yeah, she kind of ends up being one of the causes that lead to Superman dying. And of course, she has to be rescued, but the rescuing becomes extremely repetitive. She has to be saved not once, not twice, but 3 times in the story. And one of those saves was brought upon by her own stupidity. I wouldn't have minded too much if they gave her more of a purpose in the story, or just didn't use her as much as they did. But throughout the film, she's just an annoying waste of space. Then you got Lex Luthor, whose diabolical plan to destroy Superman becomes far too complicated and confusing to be followed properly. Nothing he does makes any sense, seeing as how he would more benefit from Superman's presence rather than just killing him. His place in the film quickly becomes as unfocused as everything else, and on top of that, he doesn't even feel like Lex Luthor at all. Jesse Eisenberg was casted to play the part for some reason, and needless to say, he does not play Lex very well. He doesn't even look the part. It might just be me, but he looks way too young, and he certainly doesn't look tall enough. And his acting is beyond ridiculous. I mean, every time he speaks, he talks too quickly and he has a very uncontrolled range of motion. Everything about him, from his body language to his facial expressions to his awkward pauses, feel embarrassing to watch. I guess Jesse was trying to add some personality to the role, but by the end of the day, I got the impression that he was just trying way too hard. And Wonder Woman, I can barely talk about her part in the movie because it's the least profound. She pops in and out every 15 to 20 minutes, and the screen time she gets doesn't even do anything for her character. By the time she finally reveals herself as Wonder Woman, I'm only thinking to myself, so what? She has little to no interaction with any of the main conflicts or the characters involved in them until the climax, which means they took absolutely no time in establishing her in any way. Nothing about her personality, her attitude, or her powers are even given any context. So she just ends up feeling like a background character despite being placed in a supporting role. And the acting, aside from Ben Affleck as Batman, is just really bad. As where Jesse's acting is far too outrageous and out of place to be interesting, everyone else's acting feels so uninterested and dull that nothing they do makes anything about the story or the characters feel relatable. They don't even sound interested in their roles, and they don't convey enough expression to come across as three-dimensional. This is very awkward to watch since many of these actors have turned up more interesting roles in the past. It could be because of the bad directing or how the script gives them very little to work with, but whatever it is, the acting in this movie is very uninspired. The writing itself is so poor. Like, this is one of the most badly written movies I've seen in a while. Not only is the dialogue uninspired and the overall plot a jumbled and confusing mess, but there are so many things that don't make sense that they're downright plot holes. Why would anyone believe Superman killed those people and not consider any possible suspect? Even if they had reason to believe it, why would they believe for a moment that he killed them with a gun? He's clearly shown that he doesn't need one. Why doesn't Superman hear Martha getting kidnapped, but he can clearly hear Lois falling off of a building? Is it because she wasn't screaming loud enough? Why was Superman unable to detect a freaking bomb? Even the movie brings this up, without putting in any kind of justification as to why he couldn't hear it. Couldn't he have heard some kind of ticking or used the super speed to get the explosive away from the building? Why doesn't that Wayne employee not notice a giant doomsday device destroying the city? Why doesn't anyone in that building notice the doomsday device twice until Bruce makes that phone call. How can Lex Luthor have access to the Kryptonian ship if that one guy is just a senator? Shouldn't that, have ended most of the conflict in the movie right there? Why doesn't Superman rescue his mother himself? He clearly has the super hearing and supervision, and he could have easily saved her with the super speed before any of Lex's goons tried anything. Why does the Kryptonian computer still allow Lex to go through an evil genetic mutation experiment? You know, just because the council is dead doesn't overline any of the reasons why those rules were made. And that's the stuff that I just bothered to bring up. I mean it, I didn't even go into half of the nonsensical stupidity that this story offered. And then there's the fact that they absolutely fucking butcher Doomsday in this film. Firstly, they destroy the character's complexity by retconning its backstory. Instead of being created off of the deaths of countless infants as part of a scientific lifeform project, it's just some last-minute weapon that Lex pulls out of his ass. And for that matter, how does mixing Zod with Lex's blood make him look anything like this? And how does Lex's DNA even make him stronger? And the writing surrounding this part of Lex's plan is so shoved in at the last minute that it just feels like a complete ass pull, because they needed to shove in more conflict in the film now that Superman and Batman aren't fighting anymore. But hey, what about the battle between Superman and Batman itself? I mean, it's the one thing that everyone was waiting for, right? Surely they put some effort into making it look awesome. Well, they didn't. The worst thing about this fight is that it's completely forced. Literally, all that Superman has to do is tell Batman what's really going on and not engage him in any way. And no, that 1 or 2 times he tried to tell him doesn't count. He's given plenty of opportunities to not lunge at Batman or throw a punch or try to attack him in some way. But even with that aside, the battle itself is so slow and unenergetic. There's way too many pauses that drag out too much time, and the fighting mostly consists of them throwing these lame-looking punches. Even the part where Batman swings Superman across the building looks way too slow to be exciting. But above everything else, this fight is so fucking boring. The choreography is badly directed, and it's shot in such an unenthusiastic way. It doesn't even have the proper lighting to make it more exciting. It all takes place in these dark and dull-looking rooms. So much more interesting battles have come from the animated direct-to-DVD movies. Not just because they were animated, but because they were more energetic and exciting. They had creative spins on them as the fights progressed, keeping them engaging and well-rounded. There was more of an adrenaline rush because the fights were faster and they had a much larger scale. The impact of each strike also felt heavy. They emphasized the force of the attacks, and they even added life and color to the backgrounds, making them appealing to look at. These were awesome fights because they knew what kind of energy needed to be put into them. This fight doesn't reach any of those standards. It's just a boring schlop. And then the fight just ends in the stupidest and most contrived way that it can. The infamous Martha moment. I guess this is supposed to be the part where Bruce stops his attack because he starts to see humanity within Clark or something like that. But the way that it's executed is just far too unappealing. Firstly, they feel the need to play the parents' death scene all over again and in slow motion in almost the exact same way. This probably would have fit into the movie better if they didn't show this scene earlier. And it also feels unnatural. If Clark does think of Martha as his mother, why doesn't he call him by mom? Is it because he needs Bruce to know her name? How would Bruce even know where to find Martha? Would it really have made a difference if he just said mom? And the way that Bruce just asks why did you say that name instead of just asking who Martha is and what happened to her feels very unfitting. I actually feel bad because there were ways that this scene could have been executed far better. Like Bruce begins to realize that he's being a killer like that guy who killed his parents, and this reflection in his mind makes him question his methods of fighting crime. Some of the more interesting depth is already in there, such as how Batman was wrong to see this false god as an alien who never cared about humanity. He sees Superman pleading for a human life, which makes Superman human himself. Or how he sees a younger version of himself inside of Clark, the one who's trying to do what he couldn't, which is save his mother. And then he chooses to help Superman because he doesn't want another mother or another Martha to die. This is one of the most universally panned moments in the film, and I just laid out some ways that it could have been done better. It could have been really good, but the way that it's executed is so poorly done and so convoluted that it ends up flying over your head and it can't be seen as anything but dumb. And by the time this is over, you realize that the movie's title was practically false advertising. It's called Batman v Superman, and the actual Batman v Superman part is only 10 minutes long. And that's if you're watching the Ultimate Edition. Even with that in mind, the actual fighting is so painfully slow and unenergetic with unneeded padding that when you cut that time in half, it's only 5 minutes long. The movie is virtually 2.5 to 3 hours long, and the actual theme of the title takes up a fraction of the content. But what's truly pretentious about the film is that it feels so much longer than 2.5 to 3 hours. And that's because of the movie's most fatal flaw. The pacing is painfully slow, and it's boring. Holy crap, is this movie boring. The progression of the events is just done so sluggishly, and the tone it sets for itself throughout just feels completely uninspired. A lot, and I do mean a lot, of this movie just consists of pointless slow motion. If you just sped up or even cut out the slow motion in this movie, the running time would be much shorter. Like a whole hour shorter. Yeah, the story itself is only an hour and a half long, but it's totally dragged on by repetitive slow motion and replaying several scenes in that same slow motion. I'm not kidding. Every other instance Zack Snyder gets the chance, he shoves the slow motion into scenes where it's not even needed. He seriously had to shoot Lex Luthor walking through a hallway in slow motion, like it's supposed to make the scene more intense or more suspenseful. It doesn't. It just makes it very annoying. The slow motion is used in so many instances where nothing is being enhanced or is making anything easier to see. It's just overusing the effect because Zack thinks that it's cool. It just becomes so abused that it ultimately pads out the movie's runtime. And the final nail in the coffin that just really gets to me is the ending that mostly revolves around Superman's supposed death. Okay, if you knew anything about how things went when Superman first fought Doomsday, you knew from the moment you saw the trailers that he was going to die. That alone is enough to take out the emotional weight behind it. But when you really look at it in the same way that Angry Joe looks at it, you realize that the ending is far worse than it was at first glance. It ends up making the film as a whole feel very unfulfilled, and anything that happens in the future of the DC universe feels completely empty due to an extreme missed opportunity. But even without any of that in mind, it's still a horrible excuse to get an emotional reaction from the audience. Because we know that Clark is immediately going to come back to life, the death itself has nothing to support it. And if they were really going to fit this into an extended universe, they did it far too early. This is only the second entry in the franchise, and they try to convince you that Superman is dead and that he's not coming back for the rest of the overall story. That can't happen because Superman was meant to be the face of the Justice League. He's quite possibly the centric protagonist of the DC film universe. So trying to convince us that your main character is permanently gone before you're even a third of the way through the project is a blatant and desperate attempt to get a reaction from you. Perhaps they did get a reaction, but it certainly wasn't the one they were hoping for. So how is it possible that this movie was so painfully broken and badly constructed? Well, many people have had their answers for this, but the core reason as to how it fails lies under what was in the filmmakers' minds when they were putting this movie together. This was nothing more than an advertisement. With all of these jumbled subplots going on, it's very clear that this film's main priority was just to tease future installments for this cinematic universe that they were putting together simply to compete with Marvel. They never once thought about telling an actual story with good focus or meaningful development and just wanted to throw a bunch of little commercials together. If they needed to compete with Marvel, I can understand that, but this was not the way to do it. They clearly put no thought or effort into this one, showing that they merely wanted to just rush the idea out the door without taking time to speculate what it was that people have been loving about the MCU in the first place. How it took time towards building up the grander scale, more interesting plot threads, putting them together in a way that's not confusing or too complicated. They thought they could be on par just by doing their own version of this idea, and their own version of kickstarting this idea was a major failure. So what was it that I said earlier about this movie possibly having something good in it? Well, that would have to be the Dark Knight himself, Batman played by Ben Affleck. When people first heard about this, they thought it was going to be a disaster, but it turns out he managed to surprise all of us by being quite possibly the only consistently good thing in the film. As a matter of fact, I think that he's the main character of this movie because of how much the plot revolves around his presence. Affleck himself does a surprisingly great job capturing the intimidation and brutality of this grimmer version of Batman. I personally don't have any problem with this version of Batman killing people, as it actually serves a purpose towards his character growth in this movie, and it takes time to show us that he's not just a complete murderous psycho. A lot of you know the drill here, in which Bruce is traumatized by the loss of his family and trains himself to become an agent of vengeance against all crime in Gotham, with only his loyal butler Alfred as his guide. In the movie, we see that he's constantly insisting that his methods of fighting evil are justified and the only way to control crime is through fear. He sees Superman as a destructive monster who's confused himself with a god, and the film does express a smart way of seeing the events of the plot through his points of view. The opening to Metropolis, for instance, actually takes time to address the controversy involving the destruction of the city from Man of Steel, and we see it from Bruce's perspective to help convey his reasons for not believing that Superman is a good thing. It also showcases his detective skills by showing some pretty good deconstruction with clues and gathering information. The loss of his family and the corruption in Gotham with all of his experiences as Batman has given him a very hollow belief that humanity is capable of changing on its own, and he convinced himself that he alone can enforce the change that he believes is best for the future. He deals with all of this while battling his own fear secretly lingering inside of him, including the fear that the death of his parents was his own fault. And he's even such a more engaging and involved actor above the rest of the cast. He expresses just the right range of fury and control that you truly feel that he's a faithful interpretation of Batman. His facial expressions, the tone in his voice, the strong stance that he makes when he dons the cape and the cowl, just the way he stares down his own suit gives such an appropriately intimidating vibe, as if he's looking at the suit like it's his enemy, like he's fighting a piece of himself. When he looks at that suit, he sees an obstacle that he needs to overcome, and overcoming it will grant him the power that he needs to take down this all-powerful beast. And near the end of the movie, his character development comes full swing. He begins to reflect on what he's been doing as Batman and how his methods of delivering justice from the dark isn't always the answer. He finds a newfound respect in Superman when he sees the truth, that Superman was just as human as anyone else. He feels moved by his sacrifice, a heroic sacrifice from someone who was truly human. It inspires him, brightens his outlook on life, and refreshes his hope in humanity. It's even shown in the ending where he chooses to not brand Lex Luthor because he wants to honor the memory of his fallen companion. He wants to become a better person through that honor, and he promises himself and Wonder Woman that he's going to carry on his work as a more noble vigilante. All this time he was trapping himself in his own darkness, and Superman provided him with a light to help him escape from it. He still wants to fight against evil, but now he wishes to fight evil in a way that doesn't make him so grim and on the same level as the man who killed his parents. By the end of this story arc, you feel that he's a completely changed man, and he's going to do what he can to make the world a better place in both his and Clark's image. His heart-to-hearts with Alfred have a nice sense of compassion to them as well. Even though Alfred isn't as fleshed out here as he is in different adaptations, you can still see that he's trying to be both a mentor and a father to Bruce. And the solo action scenes with Batman are actually pretty good. They make really good use of Batman's utility and skills, taking advantage of dark shadows in the atmosphere and his expertise in close quarters combat. The scenes are shot very well and have a really good pacing to them, remaining energized and having a very well range of impact. It's actually kind of strange seeing that the best fights in the movie are just Ben Affleck kicking ass as Batman. Even his voice has a really good edge to it, using this type of amplifier instead of having to rely on this forced growling hum like Christian Bale. I actually think that Ben Affleck is a way better Batman than Christian Bale, having the look, the voice, the posture, the intimidation, and the charisma to truly captivate the character. And the music is really good when it wants to be. I mean, it is Hans Zimmer and it can get repetitive with the use of the bwom, but a lot of pieces in this movie actually have a very subtle touch to them. As much as I hate the ending, I do admit that the music that plays during Superman's sacrifice and what happens after that is breathtakingly beautiful. The film's soundtrack has a lot of moments of triumph, helping to make some, keyword being some, of the scenes much more interesting. They express a proper sense of power and build-up, setting the tone just right, containing both intense and gentle instrumentals. It's certainly the movie's strongest background element. But sadly, none of that is enough to save a script so badly thought out and a concept with so much potential that ended up tarnishing itself. If this movie just focused on Batman struggling with his humanity and his conflict with Superman while cutting out all of the needless bullshit, this movie could have been good. Hell, it could have been great. But as it is, Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice is not a film that I recommend to anyone. It's boring, it's badly paced, the characters are unengaging except for the one, and it just doesn't capture the spirit of why we love to see Superman and Batman's rivalry in the first place. If you're just a really loyal die-hard DC fan and just want to see a bunch of your favorite storylines crammed together in one crappy enforced package, I guess you can give this one a try. But for now, I just want to get to more interesting and more worthwhile movies to talk about. MisAnthro Pony, over and out.